Wait. Hold on.
You all set?
I don't know. Well, where do I start? I told you I came out of an advertising background, so my work was more design oriented than anybody else there. You know, I knew how to. That's what I essentially did for a living. I was a designer, so that was heavily fixed in my work. Another thing was, well, the greatest difference of all, in a certain perspective, was that everybody working at Marvel was there for one reason: to collect a paycheck on Friday. There were a couple guys who were maybe a little more passionate than others. But that was about it. They were old veterans, old blood. They were Xerox machines doing the same thing. And I came in from a completely different perspective. I wanted to make a personal statement in this forum that I loved since I was a kid. The rest of them weren't making personal statements. That was the furthest thing from their minds. And along the way, as my commitment to Marvel increased in terms of number of pages and so forth, I found that there wasn't enough time in the day. So ultimately, at age 30, I stopped playing rock and roll, and I also gave up my advertising job, which was very lucrative for me. Remember, I told you that before. So I went from making a pretty decent living to drawing comics, which is a very small living, just a fragment of it. So I traded money for the opportunity to make a personal statement and say something in comics that maybe had never been done before. I was interested in creating maybe a new kind of vocabulary. And so I knew that my work would be somewhat different from the others because almost all of those old guys grew up with comic strips. They took the rules, the tropes, the techniques of comic strips and pulled them into comic books, which is a terminal mistake because a comic book is not a comic strip. They're two different mediums, although they have some overlap, not the same. That was a mistake that they made from the beginning. Nobody knows it. I learned to draw through comic books. But my storytelling, my narrative technique comes entirely from film. And I learned that very early on when I was a kid because when I read comics, I had a certain emotional response, a feeling, that was maybe about here. But film created an emotional response in me that was way up here. Because these guys were real storytellers working in a medium that was much more expressive. This was lower level. So I took everything I learned from those guys, Hitchcock, Raoul Walsh, Orson Welles, Henry Hathaway, Robert Siodmak, the whole great directors. And I infused those sensibilities into my comics work. And almost instantly, fans recognized that the work was vastly different from the rest of the stuff that was being produced.
Yeah.
I brought surrealism into comics. I brought expressionism into comics. I brought op and pop art into my books. And the interesting thing about Nick Fury, Agent of S.h.i.e.L.D. was that it was so forgiving. You could do almost anything in it because the structure was open. It was very loose. While, let's say if I had taken Spider-Man, Spider-Man has a very narrow avenue of dramatic capability. You have to get Aunt May, you have to get Mary Jane, it has a very narrow experimental range. And Nick Fury was like, anything goes. And I laid it in with all